Welcome to part 2 of the mechanical rehab of the Volkswagen. I was trying to get it into one video, but there's just too many small things wrong with the car and it's dragging way out. So in this video I'm going to be doing the valve cover gasket, fixing coolant leaks, power steering fluid, and whatever else crops up or keeps breaking as I fix other things. So with the 30-year-old car that's been sitting 2 years, I'm sure as I start driving it, more things are going to break until I just kind of completely go through the whole car. But let's get started. I've got the valve cover gasket done again, so time will tell if that leaks. But the next issue that has cropped up, I took it for a drive around the property this weekend and I got the blinking oil pressure light and the buzzer of death, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't actually have low oil pressure because the engine is still running, so that's one thing, and also the oil pressure gauge in the center console is still showing great oil pressure. So these cars have 2 oil pressure sensors. There's one on the head up here that runs the gauge in the console, and then you have the high pressure one that's on the oil filter housing. I've purchased a mechanical oil pressure gauge. I'm going to screw that into the high pressure sensor location on the oil filter housing and make sure that I actually have oil pressure there. If I do, then it's probably the sensor or it's an electrical problem. There's a couple of diagnostics I can do to see if it's an electrical problem, and if it has oil pressure on the mechanical gauge and it's not the electrical problem, then 99% it should be the pressure gauge. Yeah, we got good oil pressure here. Now that I've verified with the mechanical gauge that it has oil pressure, I need to do the electrical check. And for that, I went on YouTube, and there's a really good channel, Ollie's Garage. He does a lot of work on these cars, and I've referenced his channel a few times for fixing things. So check him out if you want some in-depth repairs on Mark 1 and Mark II Volkswagens. But in there, he suggested running a wire from the negative terminal directly to the wire going to the high pressure sensor. That essentially bypasses the circuit, and that should make the computer happy so that the light won't come on. So if that's the case and the light doesn't come on now, then electrically and with the car's computer, everything should be fine. And then that kind of just leaves us with the switch itself. All right, no low oil pressure light, so that's telling me electrically everything's okay. So I guess we have a bad switch. And the one that I purchased yesterday anticipating replacing that is not the right one, and nobody has one in stock. So I guess I will just change the oil today. So with the oil change, I have a good man filter, and it calls for 1030 oil, and I talked to a friend of mine. He rebuilds a lot of these and rebuilds a lot of Ferraris and Maseratis and things. And he said, Rotella 1540. That's what these old cars like. So I'll put that in it. Got some crush washers. Should be pretty easy. It takes 4 quarts of oil. All right, that's done. It was pretty easy. And the funnel works pretty well when you have it under the right spot, otherwise you end up with a puddle of oil on the ground. Let's start it and then check for leaks. leaking at the moment. I'll let it sit for a few minutes, check the oil level. Well, I couldn't find my car mount for the camera, so I didn't film it, but I took it for a drive yesterday and another one today. It's about 5 miles, circle around the property and around the local roads, and it seemed to go okay. Shifted through all the gears fine, cruised about 60 miles an hour fine. It came up to temperature okay. The only problem when I came home and parked it out in front of the garage, I had it just sitting there idling, and the temperature started to creep up. But if I revved it up about 2,000 RPM or so, it came back to the normal range. I've got coolant, I've got all the hoses to replace everything, so I guess I'm gonna have to do that sooner rather than later. So over here, I've got 4 hoses to replace. So this will replace everything on the front of the engine. Actually 5 hoses. So we have from the head to the water pump, and then this is a little T-hose that goes to the water pump and to the oil cooler, another one for the oil cooler, and then upper and lower radiator hoses. Because I've got several leaks in here. It's probably a little hard to see, but it's running down. So that's the T-hose that's hidden behind the lower radiator hose. It's leaking from the T connection. I've got coolant running down the oil filter, and a couple of the hoses had been spliced together by somebody in the past, so we're just going to replace everything in the front of the engine, do a flush, and get it back on its way. So I've already taken the power steering pump off because to get to the thermostat, it's right there and it's behind this. And while I've got the power steering pump out, I'll flush that too because the fluid looks kind of like chocolate syrup. And conveniently, there's an Allen fitting in here. So I can either spin it by hand or I could put a drill on there. So I think what I'll do is remove this hose, and then I can spin it from here, and I can hopefully pump out all of the old fluid and refill it. But I'm just going to stick it on time lapse because this is going to be a very long process. Well, fast forwarding a couple days, and I think I'm just going to fire the parts cannon at it, and hopefully that fixes it. Really, the only thing left that I can think of that could be the problem is the radiator, and this is why I'm leaning towards the radiator. So when the car's running and it's hot, I can subjectively feel the temperature of the upper and the lower radiator hoses, and they feel almost the same temperature. And if a heat exchanger is working properly, you should have a cooler hose on the bottom than on the top. So that's one reason. Another reason, I'm having a hell of a time getting the air out of the cooling system. I've done all of the suggestions, so you run it for a little while with the cap off of the expansion tank, let it bubble out, shut it off, burp the upper radiator hose, put the cap back on it, run it, let it, then shut it off and let it cool. And I can still hear bubbles in the radiator. It just has distilled water in it now, and I haven't put the thermostat back in it. So I'll drain everything, swap the radiator, and swap the fan switch, and fill it back up. Well, I'm dead in the water again. They sent me the wrong radiator. So this is, the new one's about 6 inches wider than the old one. So now I'm screwed for another week. I took a look inside the radiator, and it really didn't look that bad. I pulled the temperature sensor out of it, and I put some water in it and started sloshing it back and forth, and I did see some like chunks of mineral deposits coming out. So I've filled it with the engine flush solution, and I've been sloshing it back and forth, and I'm seeing more of those chunks ending up in the tanks on the sides. So maybe I'll let that sit for maybe a few hours and keep agitating it, and then just take the hose and blast the hell out of each of the openings, and maybe that'll flush it out, and I can try reusing it. In the meantime, I guess we'll flush the power steering system. Well, this went pretty well. So the process was remove this hose, which runs up to the reservoir, let it drain, put the drill on the pulley, spin it at slow speed because it doesn't have fluid in it, and then that purges most of the garbage fluid that's in the rest of the system up to the reservoir and then out the hose. Put the hose back on, fill the reservoir, spin it, spin the pulley for 10 seconds or so, then turn the wheels full lock to lock a few times, and then just repeat the process. I did it 3 times, and now the fluid's coming out nice and clear, well, not clear, but bright red. It calls for Dextron 2 transmission fluid, and I just grabbed this. It's Dextron 3, a gallon for 20 bucks at Walmart. And it's done, took maybe 20 minutes. And it's really helpful having the power steering pump off of it because it's so low that everything in the system will drain over to the pump and out the pump. So you don't have a lot of fluid caught in the system, but you should probably check yours. This one, it was probably original fluid and it looked like chocolate milk. It was pretty nasty stuff. But hopefully the pump will be happy now. It wasn't making any noise or anything, but the steering was really heavy, so it may have just been heavy because of the really old fluid in it. But once it's down on the ground, it probably still has a little bit of air in it, even though I spun the pump. But a few turns lock to lock with it on the ground should finish purging that out. And I guess we'll go check on the radiator, see how it's doing. While the radiator's soaking outside, I decided to take the coolant reservoir out and clean it. And part of the problem could have been with the overflow hose. I tried to blow some air through it and it was almost completely plugged. So with multiple rinsings, putting some hot water in it and blowing through it, I got a bunch of gunk out of it, and now it flows pretty freely. So if it wasn't allowing free flow of air out of the radiator, it could have been trapping air in there, and that could lead to some of the problem. But I've got this cleaned out, so let's go take a look at the radiator. Okay, I've power rinsed it with the hose, and I've got no more chunks of anything coming out. The water is coming out perfectly clear, and it seems to be flowing really well. So the last step, I'm just going to take some coil cleaner and spray it on the fins, let it sit for a little bit and hose it out just to give it the best chance of actually working. My apologies, I don't have any video of reinstalling the radiator and everything because the camera went dead. But I've got it in and everything buttoned up, and when I filled it up, it was still doing the same thing. I couldn't get the air out of the system, and it was not holding temperature like it was supposed to. And then I figured out the culprit. If you recall from a few minutes ago in the video, I blew a bunch of crap out of the expansion tank overflow hose, and I noticed that the radiator, I just couldn't get the air out of it. So I pulled the hose off while the car was running and nothing was coming out, and I shut the car off then and took a wire and ran it through the hose barb on the overflow for the top of the radiator, and it went pshh, and the expansion tank emptied and all the bubbles worked themselves out. I put the overflow hose back on and topped it off, and it ran perfect. The temperature gauge came up where it was supposed to, the fan came on to low speed, and then it shut off after 30 seconds or so, and it held temperature just fine. So ridiculous. I've spent hours and hours on this and checking everything, and it was just a plugged overflow barb. Well, I've put about 40 miles on the car, and I got it back up on the lift to do an inspection, and then also I've got a new tie rod in for the driver's side and a new steering rack bellow because the boot is torn. But for the tie rod, I've gone ahead and taken some measurements from inside groove to inside groove of the tires on both sides. That way I can roughly reset it when I put the new tie rod on it. And then it needs an alignment anyway. It seems how I did the struts, the camber's probably off a little bit. So I'll take it, have that done after I'm done here. All right, well, the steering rack bellows and the tie rod have been replaced. Pretty easy job, like 45 minutes. And with the wheels straight ahead, I did a check of the toe and have it set now, so it's back where it was before. And I'll take it for an alignment. And we got to fire the parts cannon at it again. So when I drove it the other day, I heard a little bit of a clunk in the right front. So I investigated it just now. So you can hear that over here. No clunk on this side. So I got underneath it and looked, and the lower ball joint's shot on this side. So I guess we'll throw one of those in it, and hopefully that'll stop our clunk. And another thing that I noticed yesterday, so when I shut the car off and then let it sit for 10-ish minutes and came back, it restarted, no problem, but it ran really bad for about 5-10 seconds, and then it cleared up. So looking on the forums and on Google, it said to check the fuel accumulator, which is this piece. And they said if you take the screw out of the back and fuel runs out of it, then it's bad. And I took the screw out and there's fuel running out of it, so it's bad. The fuel accumulators arrived from FCP Euro, OE Bosch. Looks like the one that's sitting up there now. So this should hopefully help with our hard starts when the car is warm. And this is one of the most expensive single items that I've purchased for the car, and it was $150. So that kind of goes to show you how cheap everything is on the car if the most expensive thing's 150 bucks. But let's try to swap this out. Well, that turned out to be a bit more challenging than anticipated. The nuts that attach the fuel line to the accumulator were extremely stuck on there. So as you probably saw, I ended up having to use a combination of wrenches and a bar to get more leverage and a big ass hammer to get the, especially the larger one in the back, to get it loosened. But it's back together, and hopefully we did not disturb any of the lines and end up with a big puddle of fuel under it. But while the system is depressurized, I'm going to go ahead and replace the fuel filter. All right, I have a new Wix filter for it, and this one's been replaced before, obviously because somebody lost the screw for here and it's just held together with a zip tie. But I'll cut that off, and then you just undo the banjo bolts, replace the crush washers, and swap it in. That wasn't too bad. Maybe 20 minutes. The worst part is that it appears that the Whoever put the last one in figured it would be a good idea to use an impact to put those on. They were way tighter than they needed to be. But we've got new crush washers, 4 new crush washers on there. It's tightened down. I started the car, it's running fine. No leaks from up here, and at the moment, cross our fingers, there's no leaks at the back. So we'll keep an eye on that. And the next thing we're gonna do, I've got a ball joint for the right front. Got a Miley replacement here. We just have to drill out the rivets and then the replacement ones bolt in. I've already gone ahead and drilled out the 3 rivets in the bottom. So the good idea is to start with a small one to get a center hole and then go up to a large one to drill off the head of it and then go down to a 7/32 and then drill up through it. I was hoping once I drilled the head off of it, I could just take a punch and a hammer and knock it up through, but I ended up having to drill probably 3/4 of the way through the rivet to pop it out. So now that that's done, I just need to loosen this bolt and take a pry bar and pry the control arm out, and then I can hopefully just knock the ball joint out of the control arm. It's just sandwiched in there, and the new one bolts in. All right, I've got everything back together. Wasn't a bad job, about an hour, 15 minutes or so. And let's check it. Very good. If you remember from a little earlier in the video, this was going clunk, 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 clunk when I tried to turn the wheel. And if we have a look at our ball joint, it is a little worn, a little covered in grease, and has a lot of play in it. So that was our clunk. And it looks like made in Germany, probably original. Well, it's riveted in, it was riveted in, so it's obviously original. So we got that swapped out, and I replaced it with a Miley OE one. So when you're working on your German cars, don't use cheap stuff, just put OE back in it. Since how the car's still warm, I'm going to go ahead and do the transaxle fluid. This should be a pretty easy job. So all it takes is a 17mm Allen, fill plug, drain plug, let it drain, and this is an easy one. You fill it until it runs out of the fill plug. It doesn't have to be like a 1/4 inch below or anything like some cars. And I'll be using Valvoline SynPower 7590. It is GL5 rated. About 10 minutes, start to stop. It's a pretty easy job. And the Haynes manual does not give a torque spec for the 2 plugs. It just says tighten securely. And since how this is an aluminum case and those are pipe threads, make sure you don't take a breaker bar to those and try to tighten them down, because you'll, instead of stripping threads, you'll probably split the case. But that's done, it's full. I'll take it for a quick drive, get everything warmed up again, and I don't expect it to be any different than before. And the fluid that came out of it, I'm assuming it had been changed at some point because it looked way too clear to be 30 years old with 100,000 miles on it. As I said, I didn't think a fluid change would really make that big of a difference, but damn, this thing shifts like butter now. Before it was kind of notchy going between the gears, but now smooth into every gear, no noise or anything. So I think we got that taken care of. Now I've just got to air out the garage because differential oil is the nastiest smelling stuff. All right, let's go. It runs pretty well. Now that that all the suspension work has been done. There's no clunks, there's no creaks in the suspension. Purrs right down the road. Brakes are strong, there's no vibration or anything. Once we get out on the main road, we can try out the cruise control. With the small tires and the tall sidewalls, it just kind of lists and rolls through a corner, but still a fun, happy little car. And if you're a taller person, you have the seat back pretty far. The shifter's a bit of a throw. You gotta lean forward to catch fifth. That came right up to temperature. It's holding. Got good voltage, good temperatures, good oil pressure. And that moves pretty decent. 100 horsepower, up to 55. So let's see if the cruise control works. I think it's on. Set. On. Set. Cruise control is not working. I don't know if that's important enough to bother with. The air conditioning I'm not going to fix. This is a car that you drive when the weather's nice with the top down. The heat works great, so air conditioning I'm not going to bother. Same with cruise control, I probably won't bother with that. The key with a German car is you always leave one thing broken. If you fix everything, something else will immediately break. But it runs well. Jeez, 60 miles an hour, cruise right down the road. It's a fun little car to toss around. You gotta work it. It's not like the AMGs and the Porsche and cars like that I've had. You just stomp on it and it goes. But this is one of those cars, if you want to have some fun, you gotta work it. Keep momentum through the corners. But you can't just stomp on it coming out and get your speed back. You gotta plan a few steps ahead. But I guess we'll head back to the house. So that's pretty much it for the mechanical video. Thanks for watching, and subscribe to the channel, and make sure you check out the other videos on this project.